Tessa Lane had already signed Nico DeLuca's identification paperwork when Nico DeLuca walked into the morgue. She was standing beneath fluorescent lights in the Cook County Medical Examiner's identification room, explaining to his older brother why viewing the body would accomplish nothing. The remains were recovered from a vehicle fire near the Calumet River, she said. Visual identification isn't reliable. Gabriel DeLuca stood across the stainless steel table, 6'4" and dressed in black beneath a charcoal wool coat. He had broad shoulders, dark hair, and a sharp jaw that made patience look unnatural on him. Thin geometric lines of ink crossed his left hand. Tessa had seen enough press photos to know exactly who he was. 33. Owner of DeLuca Freight and several Chicago construction companies. Federal investigators preferred phrases like organized crime figure. They had never managed to make one stick. Gabriel looked at the sealed viewing window. "You're certain it's my brother?" Dental comparison was positive. Height and age are consistent. There's also an old left clavicle fracture matching his medical history. His face remained controlled. Only his hand betrayed him. 2 fingers tightened against the edge of the table. Tessa softened her voice. "I'm sorry." The door opened behind her. Detective Rosa Mendoza stepped inside, and beside her stood a man with Gabriel's eyes, alive, breathing, extremely uncomfortable. "Tessa," Mendoza said carefully, "we have a problem." Gabriel turned. For 3 long seconds, nobody spoke. Nico DeLuca was 29, leaner than his brother, with a healing cut across his cheek. He wore the exhausted expression of someone who had spent several nights regretting every decision that led him there. Gabriel walked toward him. Nico took 1 step backward. "Gabe." Gabriel stopped. He didn't hug him. He didn't punch him. Somehow that was more frightening. "You're dead." Nico swallowed. "Apparently not." Tessa looked through the glass at the body she had just legally identified, then at the living man. Her embarrassment lasted less than a second. Training replaced it. "Nobody touches those remains." Gabriel's gaze shifted to her. "The identification is wrong." "Yes." "You signed it." "Yes." And now I find out why." She picked up the release folder and tore the authorization page cleanly in half. Gabriel stared at her. Tessa dropped both pieces into the confidential destruction bin. That body goes nowhere. Tessa was 24 and one of the youngest medico-legal death investigators in the office. People sometimes mistook her age for inexperience. It wasn't. Her job wasn't performing autopsies. It was making sure the person on the steel table actually connected to the life everyone else claimed belonged to them. Scenes, property, medical records, family interviews, identification. All the details grief made people overlook. She pulled Nico into a conference room 40 minutes later. Gabriel followed. "No," Tessa said. Gabriel stopped in the doorway. "No? I need to interview him separately. He's my brother. That's precisely why." Nico looked almost amused. Gabriel did not. "Tessa," Mendoza murmured. "He was just incorrectly declared dead," Tessa said. "Until I understand how, I don't want his answers shaped by anyone else's." Gabriel looked at Nico, then back at her. "Fine." He stepped away. No argument. That surprised her. Nico sat down. Tessa opened her notebook. "When did you last receive dental treatment?" "Maybe 8 months ago." "Dentist?" He gave her the name. Same dentist whose records had identified the body. "Your clavicle?" "Motorcycle crash when I was 19. "Any surgery?" "No. It healed without hardware." Tessa stopped writing. The body had a metal fixation plate. She had seen it on the post-mortem X-ray. The medical summary submitted with Nico's dental file said the opposite. Surgical repair. Titanium plate. Age 19. Someone had altered more than dental records. "Where have you been for the last 3 days?" Nico rubbed both hands over his face. "Wisconsin." Why? Silence. Tessa waited. People hated silence. They usually filled it. Nico eventually did. I was leaving Chicago. For a vacation? No. For good? His eyes lifted. Yes. The door opened. Gabriel stood there. Tessa's irritation arrived immediately. I said separately. I heard that part. Then which word confused you? Nico muttered. This is going well. Gabriel's attention stayed on his brother. You were leaving? Nico looked away. Tessa stood. Outside? Gabriel didn't move. She stepped closer. Most people probably found that unwise. Tessa had spent her morning arguing with a dead man's dental records. Her standards had shifted. If you want answers, she said quietly, stop contaminating them. Something almost approving appeared in Gabriel's eyes. Then he left. Nico watched the door close. Nobody talks to him like that. Maybe somebody should. A reluctant smile appeared, then disappeared. I paid someone to make me disappear. Tessa's pen stopped. What does that mean? A new identity? Financial history? Travel records? You paid a criminal broker? Yes. To fake your death? Nico hesitated. That was one option. Tessa stared at him. How exactly did you think they planned to create a corpse? I didn't. His shame looked real. The broker said they could stage a boating accident. Missing body. Presumed death after enough time. But somebody gave us a body. I backed out when they started asking for medical records. When? 6 days ago. And now a dead man has your dental chart and fabricated surgical history. Nico went pale. I never agreed to that. Tessa believed him, which didn't make him innocent. It only made him useful. Name of the broker? Simon Voss? Company? Nico gave a humorless laugh. Whitechapel. Gabriel was waiting in the hallway. Tessa closed the door behind her. You can glare at him later. I'm not glaring. You have an intimidating resting face. Occupational? Crime? Management? She almost smiled. Almost. Then she handed him one fact. Your brother tried to buy a disappearance. Gabriel's expression emptied. He what? He gets to tell you the rest himself? You know, yes. And you won't tell me. No. A quieter man might have looked less dangerous. Gabriel seemed to pull the entire hallway toward him. Then, after a moment, he nodded. Good. Tessa blinked. You keep doing that. Doing what? Not reacting correctly when I tell you no. What reaction were you hoping for? Something that would justify disliking you. One corner of his mouth lifted. Give me time. Her pulse betrayed her. She ignored it. Your family dentist's records were altered. So were the medical records submitted with them. Gabriel's humor vanished. Can you tell who changed them? Not yet. What can you tell? The body was engineered to survive routine identification. His eyes narrowed. Engineered? Whoever did this understood what we check. Dental films, age, sex, stature, prior injuries. There were enough matching layers that nobody would question the name once the first pieces agreed. Gabriel looked toward the secured doors. Someone wanted me to believe Nico was dead. Yes? Why? Tessa closed her notebook. That sounds less like my department. It became your department when they used your morgue. She looked at him. He was right. She disliked that too. At 11:40 that night, Tessa was still working. The office had gone quiet except for ventilation and the occasional metallic click from the secured corridor. Gabriel found her in the staff break room eating pretzels from a vending machine. He placed a paper bag on the table. Food? I have food. That is Salt wearing a costume. She opened the bag. Italian beef sandwich, no peppers. Her favorite? Tessa looked up. How did you know? Mendoza. That feels like cheating. I'm comfortable with unfair advantages. She should have refused it. Instead, she ate. Gabriel sat across from her. No guards, no phone in his hand. For the first time, he looked tired. "How long was Nico missing?" she asked. "3 months? You didn't know he wanted out?" "I knew he hated what the family became." "What did it become?" His gaze rested on the table. "My grandfather built his money through gambling, protection, theft. My father made it cleaner. I made most of it legitimate." "Most?" Gabriel looked at her. "You'd respect me less if I lied." "Correct. Then most." Tessa took another bite. "Why would Nico need a broker to leave you?" The question hit. Gabriel didn't defend himself. "Because I spent years making sure nobody could reach him." "That sounds protective." "It was control wearing better clothes. There was no pride in the admission." Tessa studied him. "What would you have done if he told you he wanted to disappear?" Stopped him. "Exactly." His eyes lifted to hers. "I know." The answer did something uncomfortable to her. Gabriel leaned back. "And you?" "What about me?" "Why dead people?" "They complain less." His mouth curved. "That isn't the real answer." Tessa looked toward the vending machine. "My mother died when I was 16. Hospital mixed up 2 personal property bags. Another family received her wedding ring." Gabriel's expression changed. "We got it back 3 weeks later. Nobody was malicious. Somebody was careless." She folded the sandwich wrapper. "I learned that death makes people dependent on strangers getting details right. And you like getting details right." "I hate what happens when nobody does." Gabriel looked at her for a long moment. Not at her body, not at her mouth, at her. That was somehow more intimate. Her work phone rang. The moment broke. Tessa answered. "Lane?" A transport clerk sounded confused. "Why did you authorize DeLuca's remains for pickup?" She stood. "I didn't." "Orison Memorial has a driver downstairs with a signed release." Gabriel was already on his feet. Tessa grabbed her badge. "Do not release the body." The driver disappeared before security reached the loading dock. He left the vehicle behind. The plates were stolen. The transport credentials were fake. And the release form carried Tessa's digital signature. She stood beside the van while freezing lake wind cut through her coat. Gabriel came outside. "You're coming with me." She turned. "No." His jaw tightened. Then he corrected himself. "Someone just forged your authorization and tried to steal a body connected to my family. What do you need to feel safe leaving here tonight?" That stopped her. "Better." "My car," Detective Mendoza notified. "No one inside my apartment." "I can put security outside." "Across the street. Too far." "Gabriel," he exhaled through his nose. "Across the street." Tessa almost smiled. Then Mendoza called from the loading dock. "We found something in the van." Inside the glove compartment was a white business card. No phone number, no logo, just an embossed chapel window. Nico saw it and went gray. "That's Whitechapel." Tessa flipped it over. An address was written on the back. South Archer Avenue. Gabriel looked at his brother. "You went there?" "Once." "Who did you meet?" "Voss," Nico swallowed. "And somebody else." Tessa watched him. "Who?" Nico looked directly at her. "A man from this office." The cold suddenly had nothing to do with Chicago. "Name?" Nico's voice dropped. "Dr. Elias Warren." For a moment, Tessa forgot to breathe. Elias Warren wasn't a clerk. He wasn't transport staff. He was the deputy medical examiner who had approved the dental identification. Her mentor. And the man scheduled to perform the dead stranger's autopsy at 7 the next morning. Tessa didn't call Elias. She called Mendoza. Then she locked the DeLuca case under supervisory hold and requested an independent examiner. Gabriel watched from the hallway. "You think Warren will run?" "No. I think he'll come to work." "You sound certain." "He trained me." That was exactly why her stomach hurt. Elias Warren had taught Tessa how to photograph a death scene without disturbing grief. how to distrust paperwork that looked too perfect, how to tell a family she needed another hour when what they wanted was certainty. If Nico was telling the truth, Elias had taught her every rule while breaking them himself. Gabriel stepped closer. "I can find him before sunrise." Tessa looked at him. There was nothing theatrical in the offer. That made it worse. "And then what?" "He answers questions." "To you?" "Yes." "No." His jaw tightened. "If you touch him before we preserve the evidence, his lawyer turns this into a DeLuca intimidation story. Anything he tells you becomes useless." "He forged your signature." "I know." "He tried to remove the body." "I know." "He put you inside this." Tessa held his gaze. "And I'm getting myself out." For a moment she expected him to argue. Instead, Gabriel took out his phone. "What do you need?" That was different. Everything Nico gave Whitechapel. Payments, messages, dates. Legally obtained. Nico won't want that exposed. Then he decides. Gabriel looked toward the interview room. The old Gabriel, she suspected, would have made the decision for his brother. This one nodded. "He'll ask." At 5:40 in the morning, Dr. Priya Patel arrived from the county's north facility. By 6, the unidentified body was undergoing a second post-mortem review with Mendoza observing. Tessa stood beside the imaging monitor. The dental records had been manipulated beautifully. The clavicle history had not. "There," Patel said. A titanium plate ran across the left clavicle. Tessa zoomed in. The implant carried a manufacturer code and lot identifier. Not a name, but a trail. Mendoza obtained emergency authorization to preserve the hospital inventory records connected to the lot. Tessa checked the rest of the body. An old surgical scar below the ribs. A healed fracture in the right hand. Neither belonged to Nico. "This wasn't just a bad identification," Patel said. "No." Tessa looked at the sealed property bag. Someone built Nico on top of another man. Her phone buzzed. Gabriel. Nico had agreed. He had given Mendoza access to the Whitechapel communications and a record of a $75,000 payment made 6 weeks earlier. The payment had not gone to Simon Voss. It went to a funeral transport company called Northline Services. Tessa knew the name. Northline moved bodies for the county. Her skin went cold. "Priya," Patel looked over. "How often does Northline pick up here? 4 nights a week?" The system wasn't operating outside the morgue. It was running through it. Elias Warren arrived at 6:53, 7 minutes early. He wore his usual Navy suit and carried the same stainless travel mug he had brought to work for 12 years. "Tessa." His eyes moved toward Patel. "What's happening?" "DeLuca identification failed." "I heard." "Did you?" A pause, then a disappointed smile. "You're angry." "I'm interested. That's usually more dangerous with you." Once, she would have smiled at that. Not today. Elias placed his mug down. "Let's review the case." "You're removed from it." His expression barely changed. "By whom?" "Chief Examiner." "That's unnecessary. Someone altered medical records, forged my release signature, and tried to remove the remains." "And you think I did that?" Tessa didn't answer. Elias lowered his voice. "I approved the identification because the records matched. So did you." There it was, not a defense, shared blame. "You're right," she said. His shoulders relaxed slightly. Tessa continued. "That's why I requested a complete credential audit." The relaxation disappeared. "Our systems are messy, you know that." "I do. And if someone used your login..." "My login didn't approve the altered comparison." Silence. Elias looked at her. Tessa had lied. The audit wasn't finished. But now she knew what he feared. "You already knew the alteration happened inside the comparison system," she said. His eyes hardened. "Tessa, You didn't ask whether the dentist sent false records. You didn't ask whether police uploaded the wrong file. You went straight to my login. Elias's voice became quiet. Be careful. The warning hurt more because she knew that tone. It was the voice he used with frightened interns. Gabriel appeared at the far end of the corridor. Elias saw him. Something shifted. Why is he still here? Tessa answered. Because his brother is alive. That family has spent decades contaminating investigations. Gabriel's expression remained unreadable. Tessa stepped between them. No one is contaminating this one. Elias looked almost sad. You really think this ends well for you? What does that mean? You signed the identification. Your credentials are on the attempted release. You've been alone with DeLuca for hours. He glanced toward Gabriel. If this becomes public, what story do you think people believe? Tessa understood. He wasn't threatening her life. He was threatening the things she had built her life around. Her credibility. You set me up. I gave you a career. And that made it yours? His face changed. There, the man beneath the mentor. I gave people exits, Elias said. People whose husbands found shelters. Witnesses whose names leaked. Men who couldn't leave organizations without putting their children in graves. Whitechapel. Yes, at first. He didn't deny it. What happened? People with money started paying. And you started selling. I kept the system alive. With dead strangers. With identities nobody needed anymore. Tessa felt disgust settle cleanly into place. Dead people still have names. Elias looked at her as if she were naive. That is something I used to admire about you. Behind him, Mendoza entered quietly. Elias didn't see her. Tessa did. Who is the man on my table? Elias's silence answered before his mouth did. Daniel Keene, he said. Mendoza stopped. The name meant something to her. Keene disappeared 2 days ago, she said. Elias turned. Too late. Daniel Keene had worked for Northline Services, and according to Mendoza, he had contacted financial crimes investigators about Whitechapel 1 week before vanishing. Elias was escorted out, not arrested. Not yet. Tessa appreciated that reality rarely delivered handcuffs at the perfect dramatic moment. The evidence needed warrants. The body needed a lawful identification. Whitechapel needed to be proven. Gabriel found her alone in the stairwell 20 minutes later. She sat on the concrete step with both hands around a terrible cup of coffee. He trained me, she said. I know. I recommended him for a teaching award last year. Gabriel sat beside her, not touching. He made you good at your job. That doesn't make him good. No. She looked at him. You understand that quickly. My father taught me how to negotiate before he taught me how to drive. Was he a good man? No. Was he a good father? Gabriel considered it. Sometimes. That answer was better than a clean one. His phone rested in his hand. He gave Mendoza the Whitechapel payment records. Tessa frowned. Nico agreed. Not just Nico's. Gabriel looked at her. DeLuca companies paid Northline years ago. Her stomach tightened. For what? Off-book transport. Cash pickups. Things my father preferred not to put in accounting systems. That could expose you. Yes. To criminal scrutiny. Yes. Why would you hand that over? His expression remained controlled, but something underneath it wasn't. Because Warren is preparing to say you fabricated this to protect me. Tessa went still. The cleanest way to destroy that argument is to give investigators evidence I would rather keep buried. You could lose contracts. I will. Licenses? Possibly. She stared at him. Gabriel looked toward the stairwell door. I've spent most of my life protecting people by controlling what they were allowed to know. His voice lowered. I'm not doing that to you. There it was. It wasn't protection without cost. It was choice with a cost attached. Tessa's fingers tightened around the coffee cup. You barely know me. I know enough. That sounds dangerously close to a line. It isn't. He met her eyes. It's a problem. Despite everything, she laughed, and Gabriel looked at her like the sound had become something he wanted to keep. It took 4 months before the case became simple enough for headlines. Daniel Keene was formally identified after hospital records matched the clavicle implant and archived fingerprints confirmed his identity. Northline Services had been moving more than bodies. It moved paperwork, personal effects, and access credentials between Whitechapel clients and Elias's network. Simon Voss was arrested in Indiana after investigators traced financial records provided through warrants. Elias was charged with conspiracy, records falsification, obstruction, and offenses connected to Daniel's death. Prosecutors did not claim he had personally killed him. They didn't need to. He had helped erase him afterward. Gabriel's disclosure cost DeLuca Freight 2 municipal contracts and triggered an audit that lasted months. He never complained to Tessa. Nico left Chicago. This time, he didn't disappear. Gabriel drove him to O'Hare himself. There was no tracker. No security team followed the flight. Just 2 brothers arguing at the curb, until Nico hugged Gabriel hard enough to make him look embarrassed. Tessa saw the photograph Mendoza sent her and smiled. He really was learning. 2 weeks later, Gabriel met Tessa at a 24-hour diner near the medical examiner's office. Neutral territory. Her choice. He arrived without an entourage and slid into the booth opposite her. "You look tired," he said. "You look expensive." "You'll recover." She pushed a folder across the table. "What's this?" "Daniel Keene's corrected identification report." Gabriel didn't open it. "Why show me?" "Because the first night we met, you asked whether I was certain the body was your brother," he remembered. "I was, and I was wrong. You corrected it. That matters to me." Gabriel looked at her for a long moment. "Tessa, I never needed you to be perfect." "No?" "No." His voice softened. "I needed you to care when you weren't." Her throat tightened. She reached across the table. This time she touched his tattooed hand first. Gabriel turned his palm beneath hers. There was no claim, no demand, only room for her to stay or leave. Tessa spent her life making sure a name belonged to the right person. With Gabriel DeLuca, she finally understood that knowing exactly who a man was, including the darkness, didn't make choosing him a mistake. Sometimes it was the only way the choice meant anything.